Does anybody enjoy just a nice long wait? You just can't wait to get to wait. You're just so excited to get to wait for the next vacation. Go wait in traffic. Go pick the longest checkout line at Target and wait in that. Waiting is so hard. And I think technology shows us how even more impatient we become. I mean, our phones are up to 5G now. That's not fast enough. Can we just skip ahead to 10G? That's what I'm ready for. Amazon next day shipping, forget that's like 24 hours. I need it this hour. You know, the longest 5 seconds of my life now feels like the 5 seconds that the little ad on YouTube plays before I get to watch the video I want to watch. Oh, it's made me so impatient. I've had to wait for lots of things in my life, even to get to do this job back when I knew I wanted to become a pastor. I mean, God had me on this 9, 10 year journey of kind of learning and waiting. Tom Petty was right. The waiting really is the hardest part. Waiting's always been hard for all of us ever since we're toddlers, even into adults, and especially in this season. Remember, we've been quarantined, and so many of the things that we used to love doing, we're waiting and waiting until we get to do them again, and waiting for all these things to come back and to reopen up. So it's great timing for what we're talking about today in the book of James. Remember, that's Jesus' brother, wrote this great book, the end of the New Testament. We're in James chapter 5 today, a little verse 7 through 12, and right in verse 7 he starts out with this: be patient. Be patient. James, so much easier said than done. He wants to talk about patience and suffering. And he actually gives us three great comparisons. He says, be patient then. He says, like farmers are patient. Now, I'm originally from Iowa. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I do know some things about farming. And you probably know a little bit too. Farmers have to be incredibly patient. They do all the work, all the planting, everything in spring. And there's absolutely nothing they can do, even with all the technology we have nowadays, and even with all the things they could work as hard as they want, try as hard as they want. They cannot rush when the crops are done. They just have to wait for harvest time. And they know that. They be faithful, they stay faithful, and they wait. And then they get to enjoy the fruits and the vegetables of their labor. The second example that James uses is prophets. He says, you want to talk about patience and suffering. Man, the prophets, you can read their stories in the Old Testament. They had to be so patient with people who wouldn't listen. I'm guessing you know what that feels like. Had to be so patient with God, so patient. Actually, most of them, well, for all of them, they didn't get to actually see Jesus the Messiah even come. They at least got to see God show up and do some things, but it took incredible patience to face of all that suffering. Then if that's not enough, James uses one more, talks about Job. You'll have to go read Job's story on your own. I don't have time for it all, but he may have lived one of the hardest human lives ever. And he faced so much suffering, so many things taken away from him, and he was challenged to have patience, to have faith in it. And sometimes he didn't, and in part of the story he did. But God ultimately restored him and rewarded that. And that's what James's point is here, is he's saying when we're patient, God rewards that. Verse 11, he says, we count as blessed those who have persevered. So God calls us to patience, even in the face of suffering and of long waits. So how do we get good at that? How do we do that? I'm glad you asked. Let's get practical real quick. Couple of things here. First, practice proactive patience. And learn to say that 10 times fast. Practice proactive patience, right? Patience isn't just, I guess I'll just sit back on the couch and do nothing and just go let God do his thing. You know, what are the proactive steps you can be taking to actively wait? Maybe God's waiting on you for something while you're waiting on him for things. Then a few don'ts for you. Don't get overwhelmed. Sometimes we get impatient because I start thinking, what if all this stuff doesn't reopen back up for months, for years? I just got to wake up, as Jesus said, my daily bread. God, what do you got for me today? I can be patient today. And I can be patient this week. So just stay in that. The next part is don't forget the big picture. That's what James was trying to remind us of, right? To keep our eyes on God's promises, God's rewards, not get caught up, as Paul would say, in kind of these present troubles that they're hard, but they don't last that long in the big scheme of things. The other is don't just do something. Kind of the opposite of what a lot of us learned growing up. You always have people say to you, don't just sit there, do something. I believe sometimes in your spiritual life, God says, don't just do something, sit there. Right? The Bible says like this, be still and know that he is God. And so part of our patience is actually a sacred spiritual practice of learning to be still and know that He is God. Trust in His timing. Don't just do something, sit there. Here's the last one for you. Don't miss what God is doing right now. Too often in my life, I'm just so anxious to get to the other side of things that in my patience, my lack of patience, I miss what God is trying to do right now. Remember this, one of the most important truths I've ever learned in my spiritual life. What God does in us while we're waiting is just as important as what we're waiting for. God's worth waiting on. Let's practice some patience.